The views and opinions expressed on America's Workforce Union podcast and its digital media channels are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the producers or sponsors.
Welcome to the America's Workforce Radio Podcast, the flagship production of the American Workers Radio and Podcast Network, where organized labor and its never-ending fight to protect the rights of the American worker come first. Now, presented by LIUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. Here's your host, Ed Flash Ferens.
4 postal workers die in Atlanta, and the union wants to know why. Meanwhile, a House committee moving to protect businesses from liability on wages and collective bargaining violations. Today on the show, National Nurses United and our independent labor voice, Tom Buffenbarger, will be joining us. Welcome to the Wednesday, July 29th edition of America's Workforce, where we're available on at least 5 platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. Many ways you can access America's Workforce, and thank you for doing that 3 years in a row. #1 union podcast in America. We appreciate that. We have a total of 3 guests joining us on the podcast today. We're going to start things off with National Nurses United and talk about the state of workplace violence in healthcare. Can you believe that? They came out with a report recently going back to 2025. And just a quick rundown here. Over 1/3 of RNs, over 36% reported increase in workplace violence on their unit in the previous year, in contrast to only 6.8% of nurses reporting that workplace violence has decreased in their unit in the past year. And this is a very comprehensive report. They talked to well over 1,200 RNs working in 28 states in D.C. between July of last year and May of this year. Now, there is legislation, and National Nurses United strongly supports a comprehensive workplace violence prevention standard. It's called the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act, which is in the Senate as Bill 1232 and in the House as 2531. It is aimed at protecting nurses, other healthcare workers, and their patients from workplace violence. Our 2 guests will be speaking to that on the show today. We're going to talk with Jamie Brown, who's been on the show before. Jamie is one of the 4 presidents of National Nurses United, and she'll be joined by Jane Thomason. Now, Jane is a certified industrial hygienist. She's also an assistant director of health and safety for the union. She conducts research, training, and education and provides technical support to nurses on a wide range of health and safety issues, and that includes workplace violence, ergonomics, and patient handling. Crazy situation in America today. You know, you study to be a nurse, spend a lot of money becoming a nurse, then you go to work in a hospital, and what happens? You're assaulted. Tommy Buffenbarger will be joining us later in the show. Tommy, former general president of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. He's going to explain something which I was really not aware of. The National Federation of Federal Employees, they merged actually with the machinists some years ago when Tommy was general president. He's going to talk about that partnership and how this union, NIFE, as they call it, National Federation of Federal Employees, is battling the wildfires. They are the ones fighting the wildfires. And he's going to talk about the crazy situation between the U.S. and Canada. Also, the USMCA, get an update on trade, which is happening right now in Washington. Now, a brief look into the world of labor. This segment brought to you by Boyd Watterson Asset Management. You can find more at boydwatterson.com. How about this story? The national leadership of the American Postal Workers Union has called for an investigation into the emergency preparation conditions at an Atlanta distribution center. Since the Atlanta Regional Processing and Distribution Center opened in 2024, this is in Palmetto, Georgia, 4 workers have died of medical emergencies. Now, the U.S. Postal Service has responded to the union's call in a written statement, emphasizing that the deaths were due to natural causes rather than workplace incidents, and that the service has worked to improve conditions by installing new emergency phones and training employees in CPR. Jonathan Smith, who is the national president of the Postal Workers Union, said that 27 emergency phones are not enough to adequately cover this 1 million square foot facility. The union has further identified several issues with emergency preparation, including poor cell phone service inside the building, a lack of automated external defibrillators, AEDs, and the absence of trained responders, emergency responders, on every shift. That same distribution facility was the center of an investigation led by Senator John Ossoff due to operational problems. Wow, something going on there, and it ain't good. Meanwhile, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce has advanced what's called the American Franchise Act. This is a bill that would amend both the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act, and the FLSA, the Labor Standards Act, to loosen the joint employer standard. So franchisors could be protected from liability for minimum wage and collective bargaining violations. So the language, which is now proposed, would mean that a parent franchise company could only be treated as sharing employer status with a franchisee, and thus be on the hook for wage or bargaining compliance if it exercised a high, hands-on level of authority over the staff. Currently, neither the NLRA or FLSA define joint employer standards, leaving agency regulations and decisions to shape the legal landscape. These have tended to shift from administration to administration, and you know where this administration is going. So this change would cement a looser standard, which would be a victory for franchisor employers. This is certainly one to watch. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, violence in the workplace, National Nurses United, and their report coming up next on America's Workforce.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
It takes LiUNA to power North America with affordable energy. The men and women of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, have the skills needed to build and maintain oil, natural gas, nuclear, solar, and wind projects that are shaping America's energy future. From new energy tech to retrofitted facilities, LiUNA members do it all. Find out what it takes to be powered by LiUNA at liuna.org. That's liuna.org.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the United Steelworkers. You can find more at usw.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Communication Workers of America. You can find more at cwa-union.org. This segment of the show is brought to you by the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. For more information, please visit bmwe.org.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. I really like to talk about safety on this show. It's important that your job is safe, and it's not safe. Well, maybe you need to make it safe or find another job. Today, we're going to talk about the state of workplace violence in healthcare. That's right, in healthcare. National Nurses United. New report finds that a majority of nurses experience workplace violence in the past year. Very comprehensive report, and we're going to get into it with two individuals joining us on the show today. I'm going to start off with Jamie Brown. Now, Jamie was on the show recently talking about Medicare for All. She's one of the presidents of National Nurses United. She's been a nurse for over 20 years. Jamie, welcome back to America's Workforce. Thanks for joining us today. I know this is really important for you as a nurse. In fact, the last time you and I talked here on the podcast, you referenced the fact that, being a nurse for over 20 years, you've seen a lot in the workplace. Maybe you could let's start right there if you don't mind. There's got to be several instances that come to mind that that should not have happened.
Yes, there are several instances. The worst case I can remember is a patient that was in the hospital for multiple months. But he threw headboards at people. He recorded us, and he was a very mean-spirited person. And the hospital never corrected his behavior. So we dealt with that for months. He fired multiple nurses, and people dreaded taking care of him and coming to their job because of him.
And as you indicated, you spoke out about this, and the hospital did virtually nothing?
They did nothing.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Well, let's join with Jane Thomason now. Jane is the Assistant Director for Health and Safety for National Nurses United. She's been involved in the union for a number of years, and she worked with a team on this report that I just referenced, the state of workplace violence in healthcare. And this goes back to 2025 through 2026. Jane, thanks for joining us on the show today. This report, is this the first of its kind? And maybe did National Nurses United do this on a regular basis? And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this podcast right now wondering, God, I didn't know it was that bad in healthcare. But talk to me about this report, the research involved. Let's get a deep dive into it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on today. If you know a nurse or a healthcare worker, you'll know that workplace violence has been an issue in healthcare for a long time, but the rates have gotten much worse in recent years. And our survey, our report that you just referenced, found that 85% of nurses have experienced at least one type of workplace violence in just the past year. And nurses are reporting increasing rates and saying that that is caused by a lot of things that the employer controls: understaffing, inadequate security, lack of support from management. Some of the things that Jamie just named in the one incident she talked about is happening every day. And that's what our report finds too. We asked a lot of questions about how does your employer respond? What kinds of prevention measures does your employer have in place? Because the reality is that there's a whole huge body of research evidence and expertise. We know what works to protect healthcare workers. We know what works to protect nurses. We know what works to protect patients, and employers are just not doing it. And that's really, I think, a core finding of our report is that employers could be preventing workplace violence. It could be protecting staff and patients, and they are not.
How prevalent is this post-pandemic? And I bring that up, too, because it seems, well, I've said this on the show many, many times, the pandemic was a game changer. There were people in their homes that didn't want to stay in their homes. It just seems like the rage of America amplified. Is this part of that or what?
It is part of it. And I would say that we have seen a lot of nurses say that workplace violence rates are increasing much faster since the COVID pandemic. In this current report, 36%, about 1 in 3 nurses, that workplace violence increased on their unit in just the previous year. And when we really dig in and ask nurses kind of like what is going on, which is what we did in the report, we see that especially with the COVID, this has been a trend for years, but especially with COVID, it has gotten a lot worse, where hospitals are more and more pushing lean staffing models, lean resourcing models. They're super hyper-focused on the bottom line and not resourcing nurses to care for patients safely. And that is resulting in a bunch of different problems, including the increased rates of workplace violence.
The crazy part of this conversation, during the pandemic, nurses were the heroes. I mean, they were saving lives, and their lives were in jeopardy as a result of what they were doing. A lot of attention was played on them, and now they're being treated like crap, sadly. Jamie, I have to ask you, as president of National Nurses United, how is this affecting the profession in general? I mean, if I'm going to be assaulted on my job, I don't think I want to be at that job. And I mean, and I'm wondering what they're saying in nursing school about this. And I'm sure retention is an issue. Can you speak to that?
Retention's definitely an issue. You have nurses leaving the bedside because of the way our patients and the hospitals are treating us. Staffing is a huge part of this. Um, because we're so short staffed on the units right now because the hospitals aren't hiring enough nurses, then the patients are waiting longer periods of time to get the care they need, and it makes them more frustrated, and and they're sick, and it's just a vicious cycle. As for nursing students, I'm not sure what the schools are telling them, but I would say if people are actually looking at going into nursing, they're looking at reports like this and thinking twice about going into the profession.
Yeah, does not bode well for the future. I understand there's some legislation. Who wants to speak about that? Because, we need to correct this before it gets worse. It's bad now. We do not want to continue this trend. Who wants to talk about that?
We at NNU have been working to get a federal workplace violence prevention standard that would require employers to put in place all of the things that we know work to reduce rates of workplace violence in healthcare settings. We petitioned OSHA many years ago. The first Trump administration halted all work on it. It's been delayed. So fast forward a few years, we started legislation, and that is what we are moving. And it's got a strong bipartisan support. It's the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act that would set minimum requirements for what OSHA and employers would have to do on workplace violence to protect nurses and healthcare workers in every state. And it's based on our state affiliate, the California Nurses Association's experience with really the landmark workplace violence prevention standard in California that has made a huge difference for nurses and healthcare workers there.
Okay, so it's modeled after one state. You're looking for federal legislation here. Where do we stand as far as getting co-sponsors on this?
It's got really strong bipartisan support. The bill has passed the House of Representatives 2 separate times already. And we're working on building that support in this current Congress and moving it forward.
Okay, good. At least it's going in the right direction. We're speaking with two individuals on behalf of National Nurses United. Great organization, a growing organization, over 225,000 strong. And we're talking about the state of workplace violence in healthcare, going back from last year, 2025 to 2026, about nurses reporting increasing workplace violence rates and the lack of employers trying to implement proven protection measures. Jane, I want to go back to you. Jane Thomason is the Assistant Director of Health and Safety for National Nurses United. Will this legislation force the hand, in your opinion? Will this legislation that you talked about, will it force the hand of the employers to, hire more people? Would that be a start or what?
The legislation would require employers to take a comprehensive, proactive approach to preventing workplace violence. Instead of just reactive, which is the stance that many employers are in, they would have to think about where are the risk factors, where is workplace violence happening, and then they would have to intervene to reduce those risk factors to prevent workplace violence through whatever is needed on that specific unit. Every unit in a hospital is different. If the neonatal intensive care unit, you have little tiny preemie babies, but there's still workplace violence there, largely from the parents. Totally different from the emergency department, which experiences a lot of workplace violence of all different kinds, all day, every day, which is totally different from an intensive care unit, right? So there's lots of different units, and the employer really would be required to look at each unit, think about what's needed. On many of those units, staffing, across the board, staffing is the most effective workplace violence prevention, but there are a whole suite of measures that together work really effectively. Making sure that physical infrastructure is safe, making sure that there's hands-on training, making sure that there's better staffing, making sure there's alarm systems, making sure that there's response teams. If a patient is starting to escalate or a visitor is starting to escalate, that there's a quick and immediate and therapeutic response. There's a whole comprehensive approach that employers would be required to take.
I have to ask how employers, the management of the hospitals are responding to this legislation because, obviously they always look at the bottom line and they're really good at cutting staff. You've seen that over the years here. But I'm just wondering, how can they I mean, I don't even know how they could, but it happens though, how they can say that this is not a good idea. But what are they saying to your knowledge?
So it used to be that employers tried to downplay the whole issue of workplace violence and say it's not really that big of a deal. But because of nurses organizing and NNU's leadership, employers can no longer deny that workplace violence is a huge issue in healthcare. So they acknowledge workplace violence is a huge issue. But they say that this kind of bill would cost too much, which is a lie. You can't put a dollar sign on someone's life, on someone's health and safety. And actually, like, there's cost benefit analyses that show that it would be actually prevention is better. Employers also try to take a different approach to workplace violence that is a little bit more reactive and shifts some of the responsibility from employers to patients. They try to, the American Hospital Association is pushing like criminalization, increasing penalties for patients who assault healthcare workers, which is not effective prevention. That's a reactive stance, and that employers that kind of takes the pressure off the employers. So that's really why NNU is focused on, like, we know from the research that employers, when employers put in unit specific workplace violence prevention plans created with employee involvement, there's a randomized controlled trial, the gold standard of research literature, that found that workplace violence rates dropped by half in hospital units when you put this kind of comprehensive plan in place that the legislation would require.
Okay. Well, hopefully it'll move forward. It sounds like it's getting a lot of support. You know what? I'm going to take a quick break here. We're joined by two individuals on behalf of National Nurses United. Jamie Brown is one of the presidents of National Nurses United. And the person you just heard is Jane Thomason, who is the assistant director for health and safety. Her background is being a industrial hygienist. We'll continue with them. We're talking about the state of workplace violence in healthcare. Go to nationalnursesunited.org and read about what's going on in hospitals. People, nurses, verbally threatened, pinched, scratched, slapped, punched, kicked, physically threatened, objects thrown. It's amazing. It's amazing how I really salute you on how detailed this report. More to come right here on America's Workforce. Don't go away.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
There is unity and strength for workers.
We are the USW.
We are the USW.
The United Steelworkers.
The largest industrial union in North America.
We represent 850,000 members in the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean.
We work in metals,
rubber,
chemicals,
paper,
oil refining,
atomic energy, and the service sector.
We are steelworkers, standing strong and fighting for what's right.
America's Workforce is presented by the Laborers International Union of North America. Feel the power right now at liuna.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. You can find more at ifpte.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Ironworkers. You can find more at ironworkers.org.
American workers are sick of struggling to get by. It's time to get ahead. In the Teamsters Union, workers are winning industry-leading contracts, historically high wages, fully paid health care, and retirement benefits you can count on. Across the country, Teamsters fight alongside our brothers and sisters to secure a better life. It's what we've been doing and how we've been living for more than a century. When we fight, we win. Join us. Be a Teamster.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, here's what you do. Just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. Always appreciate those 5-star ratings. You go to a hospital, you expect to be safe. The nurses expect to be safe, but it's not happening. We're talking with 2 individuals on behalf of National Nurses United, nationalnursesunited.org. This is an organization that started years ago in California, spread across the nation, over 225,000 strong, Healthcare workers have been experiencing a surge in workplace violence rates nationally since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're talking about the state of workplace violence in healthcare, and they surveyed over 1,200 RNs working in 28 states and the District of Columbia between July of last year, 2025, and May of this year. And a large majority of nurses, we're talking almost 85%, report experiencing at least one type of workplace violence in the past year. Now, we talked about the pandemic, COVID-19. Nurses were heroes back then. Many of them were dying because of what was going on in America. And now they're being assaulted. Well, they've been assaulted for a number of years. And Jamie, you spoke about that in the first segment here on the show. I want to go back to this rage in America. And I remember talking to the Flight Attendants Association about verbal assaults, physical assaults on airplanes, which is a federal offense. You know, that got a lot of media play. I'm just hoping this gets more media play. There's this rage in America that had to do with wearing a mask on a plane. And I'm sure that same kind of thing happened in hospitals all over America, what was going on. But I'm just wondering, the rage that I'm speaking about here and this report that came out, are you at all surprised by the state of workplace violence in it? I mean, when this report came out recently, were you saying, well, it's about time? What was your reaction to it?
I wasn't surprised. I've experienced it my entire career, and yes, it's gotten worse since COVID-19. But if you look at the state of our world, it's gotten worse since COVID-19 too. People can't afford the health care they need anymore, and being in the hospital is putting stress on them financially. They can't afford the medications that they need to stay out of the hospital, and they're worried about housing and keeping a roof over their heads. So people are taking it out on the healthcare providers that are trying to help them because it's a vicious cycle.
Is this going to become, it probably already is, a priority? I mean, you're one of the presidents of National Nurses United. I mean, is this going to be a priority moving forward here? Because like you just said, healthcare it's a big issue in America. And we've seen a lot of people lacking health care because of what happened last year with the so-called big, beautiful bill. A lot of people are no longer on the Affordable Care Act because the subsidies went away. But as far as a priority, what do you say to that?
It is a priority. We've been talking to our congresspeople and senators about this. We just had a large lobby day earlier this year talking about it. And then we're also fighting for Medicare for all. So hopefully that will help.
Yeah, that show is archived on awfpodcast.com. Jane, I want to go back to you. Jane Thomason is Assistant Director of Health and Safety for National Nurses United. And I was reading about the states. You covered 28 states around the country for what happened when it comes to workplace violence. I'm just wondering, any states come to mind? Are there states that are doing, you mentioned California. Are there any states that are just really lacking when it comes to protecting nurses? What do you say to that?
Well, I think workplace violence is an issue across the board, whether you work in a rural hospital or an urban hospital or a suburban hospital. Workplace violence is a big issue for healthcare workers, no matter where they work. In terms of what state governments are doing to address the issue of workplace violence, it's a patchwork. There are some states who've done little bits and pieces of different requirements around workplace violence, like tracking or having some kind of prevention plan. California's the only state that has the kind of robust, comprehensive requirement that applies to the whole sector of healthcare in the state. And that's been a really huge support for nurses in the state to win safer working conditions. I think the other thing I would say on the state level is that when we're looking at OSHA coverage, right? Because we want OSHA coverage because OSHA has a lot of rights for workers to activate the enforcement process and engage in the enforcement process. When we're looking at OSHA coverage, about half the states run their own state plan, so they can move whenever they want to on workplace violence standard, like CalOSHA, California already has. but about half the states are directly under federal OSHA's jurisdiction. So to get a workplace violence prevention standard under OSHA in a state like Texas or Florida or Illinois private sector, you have to go at the federal level. And so that's really, it's more effective to go at the federal level. It's going to protect a lot more healthcare workers and nurses at the federal level. So really, I think we can't go state by state to address this issue. We really have to come in at the federal level because everyone deserves workplace violence prevention. Everyone deserves a safe workplace. It's not just because you work on one side of a border that you deserve more protections. Everyone should have the same standard, and that's what NNU is fighting for.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that over 1,200 RNs, responded. That's who took part in the survey. I can only imagine, and I don't know how you did this survey. Was it like a confidential thing? Was it face to face? And I bring that up because there's probably some nurses that were assaulted on the job, but were probably ashamed of talking about that. What do you know about that?
Yeah, we know that talking about workplace violence can be re-traumatizing for a lot of nurses. It can be really hard. No one was required to take our survey. We offered it in some of our in-person continuing education classes. We run classes for our members, and nurses were invited there to fill out the survey. And we also circulated it online to our members as well as a lot of non-union nurses. So this is a mix of both NNU members and non-union nurses who filled out the survey. And no one was required to take it, but we do see that nurses are increasingly recognizing that workplace violence is not part of the job, even though that's what management wants people to think, and are increasingly ready to talk about it because that's how we win change, is talking about the issue, raising awareness about the issue, sharing those stories, and advocating for what we know can work to protect nurses and patients.
I'm looking at the survey once again, and 15.2% of the nurses surveyed, again, over 1,200 nurses, said they have not experienced workplace violence. And that could be in that category, too. They were traumatized, to your point. Jamie, I want to go back to you. You've been doing a really good job on organizing, and I just want to make a connection here because, I think we all know when you are I call it the union difference. When you are in a union workshop, well, you get better wages, you get better benefits, and obviously you get a voice on the job. And I'm just wondering, going forward here, can this in some shape or form be an organizing tool? I know you're doing a great job on that. I see more hospitals going with National Nurses United, and being a president of National Nurses United, I know you're vocal about this. There's legislation in Washington. What do you see going forward on this?
We are organizing around workplace violence. We are seeing workplace violence prevention getting put into our contracts, which is a good starting spot before it becomes federal law. So yes, we are definitely using workplace violence in our organizing model.
Okay, very good. Well, I thank you both for joining us here on America's Workforce. The state of workplace violence in healthcare, very comprehensive. 1,267 RNs working in 28 states and the District of Columbia, going back to July of 2025 and May of this year. We're talking a large majority of nurses, 84.8%, report experiencing at least one type of workplace violence in the past year. More than 1/3, 36.4%, report an increase in workplace violence in their unit in the previous year. NationalNursesUnited.org. Well, I thank you both for joining us here on America's Workforce. Again, everybody listening right now, just go to NationalNursesUnited.org. There is a lot of information posted there. Check out the state of workplace violence in healthcare. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Tommy Buffenberger, our independent labor voice, right here on America's Workforce.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferens.
Founded in 1887, the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters represents the employees responsible for tirelessly constructing and maintaining the national rail system in America. For more than a century, the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way employees has proven they have what it takes to protect its members and meet the ever-changing challenges of the rail industry. Today, the BMWED continues to fight for job security, fair wages, better benefits, and safer, more modern work environments. For more information, please visit bmwe.org. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Heat and Frost Insulators Labor Management Cooperative Trust. Find out more at insulators.org/LMCT.
America's Workforce is sponsored in part by Boyd Watterson Asset Management, LLC. Find out more about our investment solutions tailored to meet the needs of Taft-Hartley funds at boydwatterson.com.
America's Workforce Radio is sponsored in part by the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, District Council 6, representing painters, glazers, drywall finishers, and sign and display industry workers. They remind you that belonging to a union is your right as an American.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, to loggers, and miners. Back in 1965, the Blues developed the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Blue Cross Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families, all working hard for America's working families, for the health of America. You can learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferens.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Let's go to line number 2. Welcome back, a long-time contributor of America's Workforce on behalf of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. That would be Tom Buffenbarger, former general president for 18 years, enjoying his retirement. GoIAM.org. Tommy, last week I was talking about the wildfire situation, which is now really breaking out big time in Europe. But we concentrated on what happened in Canada, and where we do this show in northeastern Ohio, we got hit pretty hard with that smoke coming from Canada. It was interesting to see the political reaction to that. But what I want to talk about today, and I mentioned this because I saw it on the Machinist website, about those that are fighting the fires and how political, everything is political today. You know that. But why don't you explain, I saw in that story about the National Federation of Federal Employees that's partnered, and maybe you could explain this better than I, with the machinists on this, and now you're telling me that I guess this partnership happened when you were general president. Take me back to that time and how that happened, Tommy. Go ahead.
I can't recall right now the exact year. There was a point in time where the National Federation of Federal Employees was looking at an effort. Their president at the time was a guy named Rick Brown, to become more visible, to become more effective, and they needed more resources. So we struck up a conversation that resulted in the merger of NEFI with the IAM. And it gave the IAM's already existing federal government employee division, for instance, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, the military bases, maintenance, it gave us a bigger presence and more oomph, and it certainly brought more resources and visibility to NEFI. Over the years, NEFI as a federal union struggled with organizing, like all unions, because in the federal government, it's all voluntary if you want to belong to a union or not. We were able to bolster their efforts in organizing drives to keep them going. And it's funny how things have turned. Now today, under the leadership of Randy Irwin, who is the NEFI director, president of NEFI, division of the IAM, has done a remarkable job explaining and demonstrating, most importantly, the value of a strong union, the value of having someone to fight for your contracts with the government and deliver. And that's turned out to be good for the IAM, good for NEFI, and it's given some strength and a voice to the members that work for the federal government, doing a lot of jobs people don't realize how dangerous and important they are to us.
So, Tommy, staffing, well, across the board is a big issue. Earlier, we talked about staffing with National Nurses United, which has led to a lot of violence in hospitals where the nurses are caring for their patients. Same kind of situation here with the wildfires when it comes to staffing. And where do we stand with it right now, in your opinion?
Well, that's a good question because the fire situation has just exploded across both Canada and the US. And so the firefighters are tackling this, and there's been a huge amount of cooperation between the firefighting efforts in Canada that produced the smoke that not just Cleveland got, we got the same smoke here, and it registered the worst air pollution in history for our region here in DC. But fighting these fires, you'll see Canadian, and the Canadians, by the way, sent firefighters to the US to help our guys fight these fires. It's funny how the President of the United States recognized that by wanting to slap additional tariffs on Canada because their smoke was invading our space. No mention about the times when our smoke invaded Canada.
Mm-hmm.
The effort here, there have been several firefighters now perish in these efforts. That's something that sense of grief is shared across the borders, and I believe there was a Canadian firefighter involved in one of these deaths as well. That's a tribute and a testimony to the dedication of the Canadian firefighters, as well as our members who are doing their best to put these fires out, get them under control, and preserve our landscape here in this country.
So when these wildfires break out, it's the National Federation of Federal Employees, the firefighters that are represented by that union. They're first on the scene.
Especially when the federal government declares an emergency. These are government employees, and their job is to fight these fires.
Right, and they're doing it. They're doing it as we speak.
They're doing it.
But then they're supplemented by members of the IAFF, right? The International Association of Firefighters?
I am certain, Flash, at the size of these fires, you've got union members from all over the spectrum helping fight these fires. They look, in some occasions, for volunteers, not necessarily to be on the front line fighting a fire. You got to know what you're doing there, but to support them. Remember, these people are exhausted by now. This has been continuous throughout the summer. And so I have no doubt you'll have professional firefighters from the firefighters union. You'll have companies, especially timber companies, who have large tracts of land that our members work on that, kind of draft those timber workers into helping fight those fires too. They know the woods.
We're speaking with Tommy Buffenbarger, former general president of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, longtime contributor of America's Workforce. Tom, if you don't mind, I want to switch gears and talk about trade. Fair trade, that's the word, fair trade. USMCA being renegotiated. In fact, I had a guest on the show not too long ago saying, well, that was supposed to be a good deal. But apparently we have lost more manufacturing jobs. This was supposed to create more. And I guess this week is kind of pivotal in those negotiations. What are you hearing right now?
Well, what I hear is when we did the USMCA, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, said this is the best trade deal ever negotiated. Now he says it's the worst trade deal ever negotiated and blames it on Joe Biden and Obama and FDR and George Washington. I don't know where we're going to go, or there'll be such a significant difference in these trade pacts. Remember, corporate America follows the mantra that they want to produce products in the nation that pays the lowest wages. That's the common denominator. And I don't know that that's been addressed in any of these recent negotiations. So until we recognize the value of the human element in all of these trade deals, they're doomed to failure. And I think that's what's coming again. This is being done so they got something to divert our attention from, the wars going on and everything else, to talk about we're going to create jobs and fix the trade agreement. I don't see it happening. And that leads me to the big effort right now. You hear a lot of commentary here in Capitol Hill about the communists were raising the red specter again. Well, be careful, because corporate America loves communism. And I can cite that because where did they move a ton of jobs? China. What is China? It's a communist nation. And yet all the executives push our work there and then complain about communism. I don't know, maybe sending our work over there will result in a giant revolution in China. I don't expect that'll happen. But this is all crazy stuff. We don't sit down with our partners, our trading partners around the world, and have those kind of honest discussions about how do we conduct trade and relationships where people benefit. It's the corporate profit line that needs the benefit. We don't, I guess.
Yeah. Profits over people. It's been going on a long time. Tommy Buffenbarger, our independent labor voice right here on America's Workforce, former general president of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, one of the many proud sponsors of America's Workforce. Check them out. Go IAM.org. You take care, brother. We'll talk to you next month.
You got it. Best to you and your listeners, Flash.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Tomorrow, Roofers Local 11 and the Hire 360 program in Illinois. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.
That concludes another episode of the America's Workforce Radio Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. America's Workforce is a production of Labor Tools and BMA Media Group. Find out more information online at labortools.com.